Hi again. This is a lecture on Chapter 10, Human Services Today, in our textbook Intro to Human Services. So, the first thing this chapter talks about is how we deliver services. And there are many, many settings: clinics, hospitals, some sort of agency within the home, or in a school, or some other site. So it's important to think about where you might want to work. Do you want to work at a hospital? If you do, I would recommend getting a master's in social work because that's the main degree that people have that work in hospitals. Clinics and agencies are, mental health clinics and what they call community health clinics are really common nowadays. I've worked in a few of them myself. Agencies usually focus on certain populations, so they might focus on autism or they might focus on the people that are elderly or children. And then a lot of services are now delivered in homes and schools. So, in other words, we go to the clients instead of them coming to us. In clinics and hospitals, obviously, the client is coming to the sites, and agencies depends. So, you also should think about the settings you want to work in, urban versus rural settings, very different populations. Urban populations are obviously more diverse, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different languages. When you work in rural areas, especially in New England, it's a lot of white people and they all speak English. So it's something to think about as far as where you want to end up and what population you'd want to focus on. The other thing to think about is military and government settings. Like I have a good friend who's a clinical psychologist at a VA hospital, and so she works with veterans who have PTSD. And you can also work for the government, for the DMH or DCF or the state. So those are other agencies that are a bit more formal and certainly have a much higher chain of command. Also thinking about working at an agency versus private practice. Private practice is more of a long-term goal because you need to have a license and you have to work, at least 2 years after your master's to get your license to be in private practice. But it is like running a small business. I have a private practice. I have to do I have to do everything myself. But I like it because I like being independent. So it might be a goal of yours to have a private practice, and I think it's a wonderful thing, but you pretty much have to work in an agency to begin with. But there's also some really good advantages to working in an agency. For instance, they get you the clients, they deal with the billing, they have a receptionist who can do a lot of the stuff that you don't want to do yourself or don't know how to do. They have a photocopier and a printer, which you have to have yourself when you're in private practice. Fax machines. So there's a lot of things, and plus at agencies you have coworkers, you have supervisors, you have more support. So there's a big difference between the two. Also, community-based services, that's when they take place in the community where you go to the client. You might go to Dunkin' Donuts, you might go to a day center, you might go into the home, you might do outreach in the community like going to homeless shelters, but that's what community-based services are. And then wraparound services are usually for children. It's when you go into the home and they might have multiple providers. They might have an in-home therapist, a therapeutic mentor. They might have an ICC, which is an intensive care coordinator. These are like high at-risk kids who need a lot of support. And you have to be available not just during the day, but also nighttime and weekend in case they end up in crisis. So then they had a little box in the book about law enforcement and mental health. This is just, I'm not going to read this, but they talk about this in Austin, Texas, but they also have this in Boston, and it's called the Jail Diversion Team, or you can be a jail diversion clinician. I know some of you are interested in forensics, so you should consider this route. It's basically where you ride around in a police car and you divert cases of people with mental health issues that they could end up incarcerated if you don't help them kind of end up in basically inpatient hospitalization instead. So you're helping cops navigate the mental health situation of clients or of people. Community-based services. So that's going to the client. So remember, if you're working at a clinic, they come to you, or a hospital, the client's coming to you. Community-based, you're going to them. And that could be, here they're talking about the criminal justice system and DYS. I think that's also something that some of you people interested in forensics should consider, is working at a DYS, and I think you can work there with an undergraduate degree. And it's basically like, it's terrible to say, but it's kind of like a kid jail, but certainly less security and certainly less intense than an adult jail. But I've been into several of them in the Boston area working for Best, and it's where kids go that commit crimes and have drug issues and whatnot. And then there's community-based in the schools. So in the schools, I worked as a clinician at a high school in Boston for 2 years, and I went to the school to see my clients. A lot of them had PTSD or anxiety or whatever was going on, and they would get the services there in the school, which is a lot easier for people that are going to school anyway and might not have time to go into a clinic or a hospital to get their therapy. So community-based services are really convenient for a lot of people, especially in urban settings who don't have a lot of resources. It's where you go to them to make sure that they get the services they need. They also talk about community-based hospice care. Hospice is working with people at the end of life. It's pretty intense work, but I also think it's really meaningful stuff. And if you are interested in it, there's actually a really good documentary called, oh man, what is it called? I forgot. I think it's called The End of the Line or something like that. I forgot. Oops. Anyway, that's another field that you can look into is hospice. Also, looking at the client holistically, you have to think of them as the individual, right? And working with them individually, but you have to focus on like their relationships. What is their relationship with like their parents, with their friends? How are they functioning in the community? How are they doing in society? Are they getting, in trouble with the law? Are they going to school? So those are things that in community services that we think about, or community-based services, is we're trying to make sure they're functioning in society. This would be a class discussion that we'd have if we were still in class twice a week. I don't really know how to have this virtually, but I just want you guys to think about what it's like living in a rural area and giving services to people in rural areas versus urban areas. So I grew up in rural Maine in a town of I think it was 6,000 at the time. It might be 8,000 now. And there were probably a couple people in private practice in my town and maybe one or two places you could get counseling, which I only became aware of as an adult, by the way. So it was a very different vibe than in Boston, where there's thousands of clinicians and different therapists, psychiatrists, etc., and lots of clinics, lots of agencies. There's a lot of resources and services in cities that don't really exist in rural areas. So it's just something to think about. And I think it's interesting how services are delivered in urban versus rural areas. So then it talks about the impact of technology, which, by the way, is impacting everyone right now. I just learned how to use this Screen-O-Matic, whatever the hell it's called, that is allowing me to lecture to you right now because of the pandemic. Also, all healthcare, not all healthcare, most healthcare is happening through telehealth now. And I'm doing all my sessions with my clients through Zoom. And so I have to meet with them through the computer now because obviously we can't meet because of social distancing. So telehealth, I really think, is going to become even more huge after the pandemic, in the sense that it's going to be normalized, and so it's going to become more common, which I also think will actually benefit people in rural areas who have less access to care, and now, at least with telehealth, they'll have more access. It's one silver lining. But we also have to help our clients learn new skills. I have worked with people before who don't know how to use the internet, who don't know how to type, who don't have emails. I remember one client I had didn't have an email, and I set up an email for him, but then he never checked it, But, you try to help your clients improve their communication. Teleconferencing, they talk about the internet and web and social media. I mean, it's not our job to set up, social media profiles for our clients, but we can help them with these ways of using technology that will help them be more connected to people. And the trend in human services with telehealth in rural areas to increase access. I think that's huge, and I'm really glad that it's moving in that direction. Then they talk in the book about aging in America, which is kind of a sad topic right now. But anyway, the things that people that are elderly face is housing issues. Unless you are really good at saving for retirement, a lot of elderly people have financial issues because they might not have saved enough, or maybe it depends on their situation. There's also a lot of depression in the elderly population because, let's admit it, it kind of sucks to get old, especially when you have mobility issues, when you have health issues, when your friends start to pass away, when your spouse passes away and you might be left alone. It can be really hard. So I think what they're trying to say in the book is that there's a huge need for people to work with the elderly, and I encourage you to consider working with the elderly. In fact, if you're interested in doing an internship with the elderly, the FUS Center, which is at LaSalle Village, has internships, and I've met the woman who runs it, and she's wonderful. So it's something you should consider. You can also work at LaSalle Village, not now, but eventually when things go back to normal. And then also confronting death and dying, because that's a really tough thing, but it is kind of part of our field. I work with a lot of people who are bereaved, like they lost a parent or a sibling or something terrible like that. And so it's something that as a counselor you do need to become comfortable with, which is talking about death. Then they give all these stats about aging in America. I'm not going to go through them, but I thought they were interesting. Really what they're talking about is the boomer generation, which is my dad's generation. He was born in 1948, so he's in his early 70s. And they are people that were born right after World War II ended. So there was like a population boom in America after World War II. And so now there's all these people that are elderly in this country, which of course is a big problem for the pandemic. And it's been a big problem in Italy too. But anyway, it's something to think about that there's a lot of issues that elderly people face, and there's a lot of jobs for clinicians and for people in human services to work with the elderly. So the other thing they talk about in the book, which is notable, is how this field, there's very much a changing workplace as far as how we work and how we get paid. So the fee-for-service model, that they don't really, I don't know how much they go into it exactly, but I will tell you it from my experience, because I worked in the fee-for-service model for 5 years or so, and that's basically where you only get paid if your client shows up. And so if you only schedule 20 clients a week and only 10 of them show up, you only get paid for the 10 hours that you worked, not the 20 hours that you were sitting in the office. So that kind of sucks. So it's something to think about. First of all, you have to get good at making sure your clients are responsible and show up when they say they're going to show up. But that can be really difficult when you work with people that are poor, who are homeless, and they might just have a lot of issues with transportation, with basically holding their appointments. But the fee-for-service model is very common in our field, and it's something you should think about when you're looking for a job after you graduate, because also you can work, sometimes there's agencies that will employ you full-time and they'll just pay you a salary, and then you just work whatever work they give you, and then at least you know how much money you're making every week, versus when you do contracted work or fee-for-service and per diem. Per diem is when you just take shifts, basically, like, hey, I did that at Best. It's like, oh, we have these shifts available. Do you want them? Yes or no? And then you get paid per shift. So the thing to also think about with what kind of work you do, whether it's full-time salaried work or contracted work, is that your insurance, like you only really usually can get insurance through work if you work full-time. So I urge you all to stay on your parents' insurance until you're 26, because then you can at least have the option of doing whatever kind of contractual work you want, and having more choices of what kind of work to get. But once you're 26 and you need your own health insurance, you basically might have to get a full-time job that has benefits. Or if you're married, like me, you can be on your spouse's insurance, which is great, because then I can be in a private practice and not worry about my insurance coverage. So just something to think about. That's all. Not now, but when you're ready. Empowerment and advocacy. Part of our job is always being advocates for our clients. We have to make them help themselves. We can only help them so much. They have to learn to help themselves. Looking at the whole person holistically. I think I've used the word holistic a couple times. I'll keep using it. It's basically like we're not just talking to the person about their problems. We're talking about how they're functioning in this world. How is it, looking at the whole person and the whole setting that they're in. And then I thought it was kind of interesting, kind of funny that the book talked about politics and partisanship, but it's a really good point. Our world is becoming more partisan, well, certainly this country, and it's tough. It's tough for us working in a field where we're basically living in a country like this, quite frankly. But they do talk about healthcare reform, and in our field, healthcare reform would be huge. And it's really going to be interesting to see how things go, but I personally believe in healthcare for all, because I think that would give more access to people. So the last points of the chapter are that human services have traditional settings that are like social service agencies, but then you can also go to people in community-based service delivery, wraparound services, family services, hospice, you go to the home, corrections, you go to the jail, children and youth services in schools. In order to integrate education, go to the client in the school, social welfare services, and then thinking about rural human services is also interesting, and veterans. So there's a lot of different populations you could work with. You should consider which ones you're interested in, and make sure you do internships that relate to your interests.